Please be seated. The court is now back in session. The floor is given to Nuon Chia's defense to continue putting questions to this civil party. You may proceed. Defense counsel, please wait. I notice the prosecutor is on his feet. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before we continue our debate, I would like to clarify very briefly our position, just so that there's no misunderstanding about the objection that was raised just before lunch. The objection was certainly not designed to make a blanket interdiction on any questions starting, is it right to state that, or is it fair to say that? But the more recent questions were not really rooted in objective issues that could be put to a civil party who is not an expert, and they were open to a degree of speculation within the response, and that is not something that a civil party should be doing above and beyond the limits of his own personal experience and knowledge. And I wanted just to clarify that, so that there was no misinterpretation of what it was I was attempting to say. Thank you.
President, the International Defense Council for Nuon Chia, you may now proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for that clarification from the OCP. I do take the point. I would just like to note for the record that it is our position that this particular civil party is competent to testify about the conditions, the prevailing conditions in Phnom Penh between 1969 and 1975, in particular as they relate to healthcare issues, but also in a more general sense as he was living here during that time, except, of course, for the 18 months that he was not in Phnom Penh. Good afternoon, Mr. Civil Party. I will pick up where I left off roughly this morning, and I just have a few more questions left for you about that first topic that I identified, the one that we started with this morning, the state of Phnom Penh prior to 1975. This morning, you, in response to a question my colleague across the stage asked you, you said that at Borikela, where you were doing that triage work that you described, you said that there was a shortage of beds there and that you didn't have all the necessary supplies and materials that you needed. Is that a correct summary of what you told my colleague this morning?
I did not talk about the lack of hospital beds. I stated that there were about 50 beds in the Borikela hospital. However, there were more patients than the beds, and they were mainly the wounded. That's what I stated. So I did not talk about the lack of beds.
Thank you for that clarification. So just so I understand you, there were not enough beds for all the wounded. There were more wounded than beds.
Borikela is not a proper hospital like the Soviet hospital, and it could only accommodate about 50 beds, and due to the large number of the wounded, some patients had to lie on the grounds.
Thank you for that, Mr. Civil Party. And that leads me to my next question. You just mentioned the Khmer Soviet Hospital. Earlier in your testimony, you referred to Priya Ket Melia, where I believe you told us that you worked. What about those two institutions, based on your experience? Did they have enough beds? In other words, were there enough beds at those hospitals to accommodate all the people who needed care, if you know the answer to that question?
I can tell you that I arrived in Phnom Penh in late 1974 or early 1975, and I did not return to my previous workplace. I remained at the Borakila, and as I stated, there were about 50 beds in the Borakila. As at the Khmer Soviet Friendship Hospital, it was a large hospital, and I had no knowledge about the number of beds.
Very well. Thank you, Mr. Civil Party. What about the number of doctors that were present at that time, from 1974, let's say, through 1975? You yourself have told us that you were trained as a nurse and then worked as a medic. What about the number of trained physicians, trained medical doctors available, or practicing, I should say, in Phnom Penh when you came back in 1974? Could you tell us anything about that?
At Borakila, where I worked, there were enough physicians. There were 5 surgeons in the operating theaters, and there were other medical staff. After the 18-month work, they all came to Borakila, and as I said, there were sufficient medical staff, and there were also medical student trainees. I did not talk about the Preket Mili, but I talk about the place where I worked. So there were sufficient medical staff and physicians.
Thank you, Mr. Civil Party. So just to reiterate and make sure I have it clearly, you are talking specifically and exclusively about the triage unit at Borikela.
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you very much. Based on your experience, and this could be either prior to your time in Sisapon or after, when you came back in 1974, had you heard or were you familiar with instances of medical doctors, physicians, trained medical doctors, trained physicians, leaving Cambodia, leaving the country to practice elsewhere, for example, Europe, other countries outside of Cambodia?
I had no knowledge about that. However, I can tell you that they have trained physicians at the operating theaters, but whether there were any other trained doctors or physicians going abroad, it's beyond my knowledge.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, would you just repeat for me one more time, so I have it clearly, how many trained physicians and surgeons were with you at Borikela?
Mr. President, at the Borakila, there were 5 operating theaters, and there was not only one surgeon working in those operating theaters. There were surgeons, and there were other medical staff, and there were assistants, and there were also student trainees, medical student trainees who also assisted in our work. So I could not give you the exact figures of the medical staff working in that triage.
Thank you, Mr. Civil Party. If I could go back to something that you told us earlier about the food situation in Phnom Penh. You mentioned that prices of food, in particular rice, were quite high already in 1973 before you left for Sisupon, and then when you returned, they were even higher. I would now, with the leave of the chamber, like to put a quotation to the witness, to the civil party, from a document. This is an excerpt of a book by Michael Vickery, and it's called Cambodia 1975 to 1982. Now, expecting some resistance from my colleagues and perhaps from the judges, I would like to reiterate something that the prosecution stated the last time this issue came up, and I believe, and I will be corrected if I'm wrong, I'm sure, by my colleagues, but the position was that such material, that is, the scholarly or commentator research done by individuals on particular issues, could be used if there's a direct nexus to the witness on the stand. Now, what I have in front of me is a page of Mr. Vickery's book, and it relates specifically to something that the civil party has been discussing. So there is a direct nexus. I would simply like to put the passage to the civil party and see what, if anything, he has to say about it. May I do that?
President, can you provide the particulars of the document before we decide on this issue? That's including the document number and the EIN number or the page of the document, so that all the parties can know the status of the document and whether they intend to object to that document or not. So this is a common practice that you should have learned by now.
Thank you, Mr. President. Indeed, I will do that. As I've said, it's a well-known book. Everyone is familiar with this document. I assume you are familiar with the document. It's been on the case file for quite some time. It's a book by Michael Vickery. It's called Cambodia 1975 to 1982. It has a document number of D222/1.17. It was published in 1984. As far as I know, it's not completely available in all languages. It's certainly been available in English for a long time. It's been on the case file for many, many years, in fact. The page I have in mind is English ERN 00396999, and that's page 84 of the book itself. Excuse me? Could I repeat? Yeah. Yes.
I just want you to repeat the number, please,
Yes.
and speak a little more slowly, please.
I'll try and speak even more slowly. ERN 00396999, and that's page 84 of the book itself. So if I may, Mr. Civil Party, I'm simply going to read a passage to you, and then I would invite you to comment on it if you are able to make any comment based on your own personal experience. And if you're not, then I will completely accept that. So let me read this.
President, Defense Counsel, please wait. President, has the document been requested to be placed before the case filed by Nguyen Chi's defense team or by any of the parties?
Indeed, Your Honor, quite a long time ago. Excuse me. Indeed, Your Honor, quite a long time ago.
I wonder if the document has been placed before in the case file before this chamber, why the document only exists in one language. Can you provide some explanation to that?
I have no idea why that is the case, but I will tell you that this is a foundational document that has been used since before the beginning of this tribunal. It was relied upon during the judicial investigation. On the 31st of January 2012, we attached it, that is the Nguyen Chi defense team, attached it to an annex which is titled List of Documents to be Put Before the Chamber During the First Mini Trial. So that's 31 January 2012. That's E131-1/13.1. I believe the document was referenced even prior to that. I'm looking now at the cover submissions of that annex, which contain a footnote which goes back as far as 14 November 2011, when I think we made reference to this document before the trial chamber. So I'm sure everyone on the stage is familiar with Michael Vickery's book. Can't imagine that anybody's taken by surprise. Oh, and I did put it on the interface a few days ago. Strike that, our case manager put it on the interface.
President, Judge Cartwright, please take the floor.
Thank you, President. I am informed by the greffier that this particular book or page was included in the prosecutor's annexes to be put before the chamber. Can you give us put some light on this? Because, as everyone knows, putting it on the daily trial portion of the file is not notification in the usual sense, so perhaps the prosecutors can assist here. Interface was the word I was looking for. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Judge. Indeed, we did put this book on our list of documents of April 2011, and it was also on the list of documents of July 2011, documents concerning this first trial segment. As to whether we will object or not, I think that first we need to hear which extract is going to be quoted. Indeed, the Chamber did believe there should be a direct nexus between what is read from an author and the person being questioned, as the defence mentioned. Now, if we are questioning a civil party, we would have no objection if the passage is read out, if there is an obvious and direct nexus with what the civil party has said. In such an instance, we would not stand in opposition.
President, the Defense Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I assure you this is the only passage I'd like to read out, and I will be very brief. I'm quoting, "By 1974, the rice supply for Phnom Penh was only about one-third the quantity required. And after September of that year, that would be 1974 again, the average head of a household was not earning enough to buy the minimum requirement, even supposing it to be available. In February 1975, a family was only allowed 2.75 kilograms per person for 10 days at the subsidized price, that is, 270 grams a day, just slightly more than the DK milk tin." And that's the end of the quotation. Again, if I just repeat my question for you, Mr. Civil Party, and again, please, if you don't know the answer, please tell me, does that passage that I just read, does that conform to your understanding of the situation in Phnom Penh in 1974 and early 1975, in addition to what you've told us already this morning?
In response to this question, I can say that during the time that I was living in Phnom Penh, I did not hear about being allowed to buy 2 kilograms of rice. However, at that time, the price of goods was increased due to the difficulty of bringing goods into Phnom Penh, and maybe this also was not living in Phnom Penh and could not know the real situation in Phnom Penh back then.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Civil Party. And one last follow-up question to that. During your entire time, or not your entire time, but during your time in Phnom Penh, were you working for the government, the Lon Nol government?
In 1969, I engaged in medical study, and I completed in 1972 or 73. Then I worked at Praket Mili Hospital. Then I went to Sisapon. Of course, I was part of the government employees as I worked for the state.
Thank you, Mr. Civil Party. That's all I wanted to know about that. Then maybe let me ask you another question related to that. Based on your own experience, were the conditions, those, for example, the increased price of rice for perhaps people who were not working for the government, was that, as some have said, compounded, that is to say made worse, by the incompetence and corruption of that very government that you worked for? That is, the Lon Nol government.
Mr. Defense Counsel, I am here not to respond to that kind of question. I can tell you from my experience of the regime, but I am not here to give you an analysis on what you just asked. But if you ask me whether the situation was difficult based on my experience, I could respond to that. Because I was in Phnom Penh before its fall.
Perhaps it didn't come through clearly. You were indeed working for the Lon Nol government, as you said. That's correct?
Response. I think I will also have to ask you a question. A person who works in the state, and then if you worked for that state, you may ask who was the leader of the country, or which government was in power from that period of time. The president. Civil party, you are instructed to respond to the question. Indeed, if you do not wish to respond to any of the questions, then you have the right not to do that. But if you can, please respond to the question. But don't ask question to counsel, because your response is relevant to what you have experienced during that time. And if you don't know about this, you just say you don't know and that your knowledge is limited to what you know. You may say so.
And Mr. Civil Party, if I may, let me be very clear. I'm not attempting to criticize you in any way for anything that you have done. I'm simply trying to ask you some factual questions. So I hope, if it seemed like I was attempting to criticize you, I apologize for that. I certainly wasn't. So I'll just repeat my question. Based on your experience working for the Lon Nol government, would you agree with what others have said, that the incompetence and corruption of that regime, not you, of that regime, compounded, that is, made worse, the living conditions in Phnom Penh prior to April 1975?
Response. The question is not relevant to my presence at this chamber at that time, and I would not be asked a question why or what happened before the fall of Phnom Penh.
Well, I sincerely do not wish to argue with you, Mr. Civil Party, but if I may remind you, since last week, you have indeed been answering many questions about what happened prior to the fall of Phnom Penh. So I'm not quite sure I understand your last statement. You answered questions by the Civil Party co-lawyer about pre-1975 events. You answered questions by the prosecution about those same events. You answered questions by Judge Laverne, and you've even answered some of my questions. So I'm not quite sure I understand your last comment. Is it that you do not wish to discuss the incompetence and corruption of the Lon Nol regime in particular? Is that your complaint?
Response. Indeed, you put the question to me. But my response is that what I saw in Phnom Penh prior to the capture of the city by the Khmer Rouge is what I would like to tell the chamber and you now, because I already made clear to myself that if I still live, I will have to take the stand and tell the chamber all about this.
Okay. Let me try another question related to this topic. Just last week, your Prime Minister requested the United States government to forgive certain Lon Nol era debt because, as he put it, the money was used by a pro-American government in the 1970s to repress its own people. So in particular, the last part of that sentence, that the money was used to repress its own people. Do you agree, in any sense, with that assessment? And I will ask you not to answer that question because my colleague is on her feet, presumably to make an objection.
The President, civil party, please hold on and counsel for the civil parties. You may proceed.
Mr. President, I believe that this very interesting question is not appropriate for today's hearing. I do not believe that Mr. Measaran should be required to analyze the political situation. And the previous question already led Mr. Measaran to take a position in regard to what was happening under Lon Nol. He was an official working for the state, and therefore these questions are not relevant and they should not be put to him, especially the last question.
If I may reply very briefly, I'm not interested in the political situation today with this particular question. I'm interested in Hun Sen's characterization of the previous regime, that is the regime that was in power prior to 1975, as a repressive one, as one that used aid money to repress its own people. Now, I'm sure everyone on the stage is well aware that that is a fixture of our defense, has been since 2008, if not prior to that. It's a relevant question in my submission. It's related, in part, to the justifications put forward for the evacuation of Phnom Penh, whether or not anyone in this courtroom wishes to rule on them, believe them, what have you. It's relevant to our position. The prevailing conditions, including the way the Lon Nol government ran this country prior to 1975, is a relevant contextual consideration.
The President, the objection by counsel for the civil parties is sustained. The question is neither relevant nor appropriate before the chamber because it is about the question that asks civil party to give his own personal opinion, which is not proper for the environment in this courtroom now.
Well, if I may just add, the civil party has been giving his own personal opinion since he took the stand. He's giving his personal experience, personal observations.
The President, we have already ruled upon this. Civil party is now instructed not to respond to that question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Civil Party, I will move on to the second area of discussion I mentioned earlier this morning, and that is the imminent American bombing as a justification for the evacuation of Phnom Penh. I believe you spent quite a bit of time discussing that already. First of all, let me preface my question. Before I ask you any questions, let me say one or two things. First of all, as you heard this morning, from the quotations read out in court by my colleague across the stage, our client, Nguyen Chia, obviously does not deny his involvement in the evacuation. In fact, he has made plain that he was involved in that decision. That is something that we have accepted for a long time. Of course, we accept, as we must, as a historical fact, that the evacuation took place. No one disputes that. And finally, if I just may say, I have absolutely no issue with the factual rendition that you've given here in this courtroom. I accept what you've said about your journey from Phnom Penh into the provinces. I do have one issue. With respect to this matter, So, if I may now, just let me reiterate something that you said. Last week, you told us that the reason given to you and to others for the evacuation of Phnom Penh was that Americans were about to bombard the city. And you've told us that again today. That's correct. Is that correct? Excuse me.
Response: yes, it is.
Thank you. And you also told us last week, and I believe you mentioned it again today, that at the time you accepted that justification, you believed that justification. As you said this morning, I think it could turn out to be true, but then later on you began to develop certain suspicions as to that justification. Is that correct?
Response: yes, it is correct. And the reason that I felt that after 3 days no bombs fell down from the sky, I could see that it was part of a lie. And at the same time, I also felt suspicious that although the 3 days passed, it could have happened sometimes in the future. Who knows?
Thank you for that, Mr. Civil Party. And I, of course, accept that no bombs actually fell. We all accept that. It's a historical fact. After April 1975, no one could say otherwise. However, what I'm interested in, and you've just used the word again, and now please correct me if I'm wrong, because this is how it's coming through on my English translation. You used the word lie. That's the English word that I've heard. You used it several times last week. You've used it several times this morning. So what I would like to ask you is, first of all, in what sense did you use that word lie? Did you use it in the normal English sense that I understand to include a deliberate intent to deceive people, or a deliberate intent to falsify information? Is that what you meant by lie?
Response: 3 days, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th of April, bombs were not dropped. So we were told that bombs would fall down from the sky during this period of time. But after these 3 days, such bombs were not dropped, so it, to me, was a kind of deceitful message.
Okay. Let me give you an example to try and get at what I'm trying to get at. Let's just pretend for a moment, I'm going to give you a hypothetical example. Let's say I were the mayor of a particular city, and I truly believed that a very damaging hurricane was about to strike that city and do a massive amount of damage, and that I then told people to leave the city, and then, as it happened, the hurricane didn't come. Would you characterize that as a lie?
The President, Civil Party is now instructed not to respond to the question. The instruction has already been made clear that any question that is speculative in nature is not permitted. It has been the rule all along already.
Well, let me perhaps try a more concrete example. Let's just say that the individual running these proceedings banned so-called leading questions, and then leading questions were asked many times in the courtroom.
The President, we have already ruled upon this. If you feel that you have no further questions to be posed to the civil party, then it would be of great assistance to the chamber if you cede the floor over to the other councils. Now, we have already ruled upon this, so let's treat this as a jurisprudence for our application of of our practice here before the chamber. If you still have some other concrete questions that are relevant to this segment of the trial, you are indeed allowed to proceed. And make sure again that the questions must be falling within the framework, the context of the first segment of the trial, which is case file 002/01. And the questions shall be framed to make sure that they fall within the knowledge and experience faced by this civil party before us.
Thank you, Mr. President. What I'm trying to do now, what I've been trying to do with the last two questions, one was cut off, but what I was trying to do is I'm trying to get at the meaning of the word lie as used by this particular civil party. So that, I would think, everyone would accept is obviously relevant. When a witness or a civil party uses a particular word, what they meant by that word is clearly, obviously, I would say, a relevant line of inquiry. Forgive me for using the leading question analogy.
The President, you are now advised to proceed to another question instead. This civil party is most likely not a legal practitioner, and perhaps it is not best for him to be here in his capacity as a civil party to elaborate further on legal matters. And we have already told him that he is here to tell us about what he has experienced, what he witnessed, and any questions that fall within this realm would always be allowed. And this morning, we also noted that you took issue when the co-prosecutor was putting question concerning the conclusion or some kind of speculation by the civil party. So at the same time, we hope this rule would also be applied when you're on your feet.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was not talking law, I was talking semantics, but I will move on. Mr. Civil Party, you mentioned this morning that you believed that justification, that is, the justification that was given to you by unidentified individuals, that the U.S. bombing was imminent. And I have you in my notes as saying it could turn out to be true. And that answer, it could turn out to be true, was given, I believe, in response to the questions as to why you initially believed it. So why, again, if we could stay with this, why did you initially believe it? Why did you think that it could turn out to be true?
Response. Mr. President, people who told patients to leave the operating theater, there were soldiers who told us that the Americans would drop bombs and that we had to leave quickly. I was compelled to leave, and I left. And at that time, I was thinking to myself that since the Khmer Rouge were moving closer to, or were seen in Phnom Penh, that bombs would be dropped on them or on us. So this was part of the justification. I believe that the bombs would not be dropped on civilians, but on the Khmer Rouge soldiers, and I was convinced, and I felt that it could be the case.
Thank you, Mr. Civil Party. Let me stay with this topic for just one more question, and then I'll move on. Would you agree with me that you have no direct knowledge as to whether or not the individuals that gave you that justification actually believed it? Would you agree with that?
Response. I am afraid I cannot talk on behalf of the person who told us about this, because I were actually not him.
Very good, Mr. Witness. That's exactly what I hoped you would say. Excuse me, Mr. Civil Party. I will now move on to my third line of questioning. Actually, if we could just, before I do that, if we could just briefly turn, and I didn't mention this earlier, but let's talk very briefly, if we may, about the time you spent in transit from Phnom Penh to the provinces. Are you able to tell us, are you able to tell the Chamber anything about the condition of the roads that you traveled on?
Response. Could you please be more precise on which part of the road you're referring to?
Well, I would ask you to describe the condition of the roads on your entire journey. Did you find those roads intact? Were they in good shape? Were there signs of damage? Had parts of the road been destroyed? Things like that. Did you notice? If you didn't notice, certainly okay.
Response. Churoi Chongwa Bridge was cut off, and traffic was not possible at that time from one side to another end of the bridge. And I had to travel from Dayat all the way to Sisupon. And we were traveling on the same road that had been traveled by other people before. The difference was that at that time the road was quiet.
Thank you, Mr. Civil Party. And Your Honors, if I could just note for the record that I've been informed by my colleagues that they do not have any questions for the Civil Party. I will try to wrap up as quickly as I can, but I do have a few more questions I'd like to ask the Civil Party. Mr. Civil Party, as a party to these proceedings, as a party with rights, as a full rights party to the proceedings, shall we say, are you at all concerned that this chamber is not materially able to proceed with the trial at a pace required by the applicable human rights standards? That is to say, are you at all concerned with the fact that this court is apparently running out of money?
The President, civil party is instructed not to respond to the question as it is somewhat not relevant.
If I could just state for the record my position on relevance, the human rights jurisprudence that applies.
The President, no record is made on this. Please proceed to another question, because we have to ensure that time is wisely spent and that Council is not allowed to use this floor for making any further record on irrelevance of this question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll move on. Mr. Civil Party, would you agree that one obvious way to deal with this problem would be to ask Mr. C. in Visoth to give back some of the many thousands of dollars he stole from the tribunal during his time as director of the Office of Administration? I believe that was a 3-year tenure.
The President, this question is yet not relevant, and perhaps you also will have problem having stated this statement without justification, and the civil party is also instructed to only respond to questions that are relevant to the portion of the trial, and Council is instructed not to ask any of these questions, otherwise your mic will be cut off. Again, if you have no more questions, you even can stop now.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was simply basing that question on what I considered to be a matter of common sense, but I will move on. Mr. Civil Party, are you familiar?
The President, the Council, could you please hold on? The President, Judge Cartwright, you may now proceed.
Thank you, President. The Chamber would like to remind Council that this civil party is clearly a person who has suffered. He deserves to be treated with more humanity and respect. And I simply remind you of what the President has said. If you have no more relevant questions, respectful questions, then please finish now. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Cartwright. Mr. Civil Party, let me just say, as I've said earlier, I have no reason to doubt anything that you've told us here. I have nothing but the utmost respect for you as an individual, for you as a civil party, and for you as someone who obviously suffered at a period of your life. I want to make that very clear to counter the insinuation made by Judge Cartwright that I lack humanity. Now, I will turn to one last question. As a party to these proceedings, as somebody that presumably cares deeply about this country, are you familiar or have you read recently a Human Rights Watch report entitled "Tell Them That I Want to Kill Them: 2 Decades of Impunity in Hun Sen's Cambodia. And I would note
The President, Council, your question strays too far away from what being debated before the chamber. We have made it clear time and again that only relevant questions are allowed, and we are convinced that your question is not what the civil party is knowledgeable to respond, and we already advised you on this. We will do our best to make sure that the proceedings are properly conducted effectively as well.
Thank you, Mr. President. That will be all for me. I would just like to note for the record that based on that question, the base...
The President, I believe we made it clear that you are not here to make any record concerning the irrelevant questions. Civil party he is before us to give his testimonies and not to respond to irrelevant questions.
Mr. Civil Party, thank you for answering my questions today. Thank you for coming to assist the Chamber, and I wish you all the best.
The President, thank you very much. The Civil Party. Next, we would like to proceed to councils for Mr. Ingsari, if you would like to be heard.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, Jonas. Good afternoon to the prosecution and my colleagues and everyone in and around the courtroom. Good afternoon, Mr. Mirsaran. My name is Awadom. I am the co-counsel for Mr. Ingsari, and my international counterpart is absent this afternoon. I have no question for you, and your presence here today is much appreciated. And on behalf of Mr. Ingsari, I sincerely thank you for your testimony in contribution to ascertaining the truth, and I wish you all the best for your return. And Mr. President, thank you. President, the floor is now given to Keo Sampon's defense to put a question to this civil party if you wish to do so. Counsel, thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, everyone in and around the courtroom. On behalf of my client, Mr. Kisampon, I do not have any question for this civil party. Thank you. President, Mr. Misarand, as a civil party to the proceeding before this chamber, you have the right to make a statement expressing your suffering that you experienced during the regime, including both physical, psychological, as well as material harms or damages, which are the direct consequence of the harms alleged. And that is related to the facts alleged against the accused Nunchi Ingsari Keo Sampon. During the entire democratic Cambodia regime, if you wish to do so, the floor will be given to you. Civil Party, Mr. President, I sincerely thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so. The prosecution and the trial of the Khmer Rouge leaders is the hope that I have held for a long time. I lost my wife and my family members, and I am confident that this court will find me justice. So far, until today, I still do not understand the nature of the acts committed by the Khmer Rouge, and it is my strong hope that this court will find the truth. And I apologize if my request is not denied. I will request that all the bones or the skeleton remains that are being displayed at the moment shall be cremated. Those bones could also be the bones of my wife, and it is not appropriate to hold those skeleton remains in a cage for display. And if the court can do so, I would very much appreciate it. However, if it cannot be done, well, that's it. But I still urge and appeal to the chamber to cremate those skeleton remains according to the Cambodian tradition. They were the remains of those people who were killed. They were killed by those people. And of course, this is something humanely that this court can do. And it is in my mind, I still insist that those bones shall be cremated according to the tradition, the Cambodian tradition, and then the ash shall be stored in a stupa as a symbol for people to recall of what happened. I dare to speak this out before this court, and if it is not appropriate, I would express my humble apology to this court. I have lost my wife for so long, and I did not even know what happened to the child that my wife was carrying at the time. And if my wife was killed or died and any of her skeleton remains are still maintained in the display, then it would not be appropriate. And if we want the next generation to remember of what happened during the regime, then the ashes of the cremated remains shall be stored in a stupa or something. President, thank you, Mr. Misaran. The hearing of your testimony in the capacity as a civil party has come to a conclusion. You are now excused, and your testimony will contribute to ascertaining the truth, and you can now return to your residence or wherever you wish to. And on behalf of the chamber, I wish you a safe trip back home, and all the best to you. Court officer, in cooperation with visual unit, please arrange for the return of Mr. Misaran to his residence or wherever he wishes to do so. And Mr. Misaran, you may now leave the courtroom. Parties and public are informed that for the remainder of this afternoon session, we will hear the testimony of the civil party TCCP 105. However, that will be done after a short break. We will take a break and return at 3 p.m.